First of all, today's podcast is going to cover a lot of difficult issues, which might not appeal to all listeners. If you enjoy listening to topics such as human rights, politics, racism, and justice, then stay tuned. And if you don't, then listen to a different episode. We have lots of different episodes covering different topics. Well met to all my friends listening here today, all of you lovely people, and cats and dogs. My name is Sham, no Shamu. I'm not a cat, I'm a human, and I'm the proprietor of Green Square Cafe here in Komae, Tokyo, an Eikaiwa cafe where you can sit back, relax, and get better at English by protesting the injustices that have affected this world. We have changed our opening hours for a few reasons. One, because of the old coronavirus. And two, because Hitomi and I have had a baby. Hitomi did all the hard work, and she pushed out a little man called Leo. Yeah, he was successfully born 11th of May. So yes, I'm trying to be a helpful and supportive partner, so our opening hours have changed, and for any inconvenience this may cause, I sincerely apologize. 申し訳ございません. We are now open from 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. from Tuesday to Saturday. Sundays we are open until 1 p.m. and Mondays we are closed for cleaning and for childcare. So please stop by and you may get to meet a tiny human being called Leo. I will include a couple of pictures of him in the transcript because he is absolutely adorable. Yes, I have become an oyabaka, a parent who is overly fond of their child, a doting parent. That's me. Sometimes. Sometimes Leo is a little pain in my bum, in my backside. Check out the website for transcripts of the lesson. The transcripts always have extra content, information, and more English, French janakute English. Download them at www.greensquare.jp. That is www.greensquare.jp. Onchi. So, welcome to the podcast called Sham Talk. Yep, it's me, Sham, and I'm talking today alone again about protests. So look, a lot of the podcasts I post pretty late because first, I am a little bit lazy. Second, it's a lot of work to make these transcripts for the podcasts, so please download them. Third, I'm super busy. Yeah, but I will try to keep on top of current events. The event which is most current now are the protests against police brutality. So where do we begin? This is an absolutely mammoth topic for me to cover, and it is something which I am tremendously interested in, as I think everyone should be, because the nature of protests and getting your voice heard varies by country and by culture. In China, protests are squashed quite rapidly. In France, the people protest every weekend for some reason or another. In America, they protest in many forms and for various reasons, especially against racism, abortion, gun violence, police brutality, or they protest for equality, for unity, for democracy. So let's have a look at protests. First, let's go to the modern protests affecting the world today, the George Floyd protests. Now, these protests have been sparked or started by, well, the numerous deaths of African Americans in police custody, most recently the death of George Floyd. There have been protests against police officers and against racist police officers held in a lot of major cities in the world: Atlanta, Georgia, New York, Washington DC, Seattle, Los Angeles, San Francisco, London, Milan, Paris, Berlin, Tokyo and Osaka, Auckland and Wellington in New Zealand, and other parts of the world. These protests have spread to many countries, yep. But how are people protesting? So I guess a normal protest is a large number of people holding up signs and chanting their messages and trying to let people know about an issue, trying to inform the government to deal with a particular issue by coming together in large groups and shouting their messages. People also march through the streets. You can also call these protests rallies. They are usually very peaceful. But that is not the only way to protest. You can hold events, such as discussions and even parties or concerts, in order to bring attention to an issue which is important to you. Protests are basically just a way to complain. It's a way to get your voice heard and to complain about something which displeases you, which you think is unfair, which is wrong. Now, the protests recently have also included a lot of vandalism, and whether this is right or wrong is not my place to say. There have been many instances of vandalizing statues of people who are known to be racist and who have done some terrible things. In Bristol, in England, a statue of Edward Colston, a trader and a known dealer in slaves, was thrown into a river. His statue was thrown into a river, yeah, and numerous other statues have been boarded up in London to protect them from vandals. In Milan, a statue of Indro Montanelli was vandalized. People wrote words like rapist and racist on the statue because he bought and married a 12-year-old Eritrean girl. He was a famous Italian journalist and writer, and for me his actions were horrendous, but that does not erase the fact that he is considered a brilliant journalist. This was a protest against the colonial rule of Italy and its fascist regimes. So people have been protesting by vandalizing statues of known racists and slave traders. One controversial figure in Britain at the moment is Winston Churchill. And maybe one day I will record a podcast on my opinions on Winston Churchill and whether or not he was racist. But for now, I will just say that he was a hero. Colin Kaepernick. He is an American footballer and a civil rights activist. In 2016, after a string of African American deaths by the hands of white police officers, Colin Kaepernick remained seated during the American national anthem, played before an American football game, to protest the violence against black citizens by law enforcement, police officers. He said, "I am not going to stand up to show pride in a flag for a country that oppresses black people and people of colour. To me, this is bigger than football, and it would be selfish on my part to look the other way. There are bodies in the street and people getting paid leave and getting away with murder. A lot of people criticized him for remaining seated, saying that he was disrespecting the American flag and the soldiers who fight for America. Mr. Kaepernick was protesting the deaths caused by law enforcement by sitting down, and people said he was disrespecting soldiers? What? Yeah. Eventually, he changed his style of protest. He didn't remain seated, but he went down on one knee. He took a knee. He bent the knee. Going down on one knee is a sign of respect. Think about it. You go down on one knee to propose. Subjects will go down on one knee in front of the Queen when they are being knighted. A long time ago, knights would bend the knee in the presence of their lord to show obedience, loyalty, and respect. Mr. Kaepernick did not stand up for the national anthem like everyone else did. So it brought attention to the issues he wanted to bring attention to. But he also didn't remain seated. He went down on one knee to show respect for the military, for soldiers fighting for America, fighting for the flag. So he was protesting violence against people of color, and he was trying to be respectful to the military. Seems fair enough, right? Nope. Critics continue to say that he was disrespecting America by protesting in this way while the national anthem is playing. Donald Trump condemned his protests. American football team owners refused to sign Mr. Kaepernick, so now he has no team. There were a lot of American football players who followed his lead and took the knee during the national anthem as a sign of protest. Peaceful, yet effective. After Donald Trump became president, there were numerous protests. Why? Because Donald Trump has been accused of racism, sexism, misogyny, sexual misconduct by at least 25 women, and being a denier of science. The day after his inauguration, on the 21st of January 2017, more than 470,000 people marched on Washington, D.C. to support women's rights. This march went international as well, with more than 600 marches planned in the US and 81 other countries on the same day. It has been estimated that between 3.2 million and 5.2 million people participated in the marches just in the US. So this was the largest single-day protest in American history. Then on Earth Day, on the 22nd of April 2017, around 100,000 people marched on Washington, D.C. again to celebrate science and encourage the government to make decisions based on scientific evidence, particularly on issues such as climate change and public health. We can see from Donald Trump's presidency that he doesn't really believe in science, and this march was in response to that. It was peaceful and effective because it gained a lot of attention, but it was also not effective because Donald Trump still doesn't believe in science. Yeah, not much more to say on that. So, there have been peaceful protests, and recently the protests in America have become somewhat violent. Sometimes they have developed into riots. In 2011, in London, a man named Mark Duggan was shot and killed by the police. This was on the 4th of August. On the 6th of August, there were protests speaking out against his death outside a police station in Tottenham. And they were peaceful at first, but after a while, well, there were no police officers who came out and acknowledged or addressed the crowd. And eventually a police officer pushed a woman back and she fell, and the crowd got angry and things became violent. When this happened, people went on social media and called their friends to come and join in the riots. And it became very violent. I think at that point people realized the power they had in numbers, and they came out and they burnt buses, police cars, ambulances, and started looting and rioting. The original protest was against police violence, and then people just started destroying things, buses and ambulances and shop windows, and then people just started stealing things, looting things. It was absolutely ridiculous. And it lasted a few days, and it spread to other cities in England. More rioting, more looting. I remember there was a video of someone stealing a young boy's PlayStation Portable from his backpack, and Sony offered him another one for free after that video went viral. We're seeing something very similar now. Riots in America, people looting from shops and destroying things for no reason, and there is a difference. There is a difference between nonsensical violence, recreational rioting, and meaningful protest. There should be protests around the world. People should have a voice. But they shouldn't destroy things without serious thought. They shouldn't break into people's shops. They shouldn't make statements about an entire group of people. Not all police officers are racist. I want to make that 100% clear, crystal clear. Not all police officers are racist. Not all white people are privileged. Not all black people are violent. Not all protesters are rioters. Not all rioters are wrong. You can never make a statement about an entire group or race of people and expect it to be correct 100%. You can't. It's not possible. Not all Japanese people like sushi. Not all British people like tea. I do. I love tea. I would drink it all day and all night. I'm drinking tea right now. But not all British people do. Not all British people like tea. These are called generalizations. Making a statement about a group of people. It's a generalization. Yeah? More about generalizations in the transcript. Generalizations. People protest against them as well because they are a form of discrimination. These protests are pretty violent. They have been pretty violent. But they are nothing compared to what has been happening in Hong Kong. People there have been trying to protest peacefully against the introduction of a law which would allow criminals in Hong Kong to be extradited or transferred to China. That is a very basic explanation of why people are protesting. I think Hong Kong does not really want China to interfere in the matters of Hong Kong. Hong Kong has its own political system and they have independence, and they don't want interference from China. And the general fear was that China was trying to steal the democracy of the Hong Kongese people. These protests were called riots by critics who are pro-China, but they were largely peaceful, and in fact the main source of violence was the police. The police used a lot of force against the Hong Kong protesters. There were also reports of Chinese gangsters or mafia assaulting protesters on the train, and the police did nothing. They literally watched and did nothing. There have been many fights between the police and the protesters. Protesters took control of Hong Kong Polytechnic University, and police tried to enter the university, but protesters attacked the police with petrol bombs and they blocked roads. Yeah, using petrol bombs against the police, I don't think that's a good idea. I don't think that's right. I don't condone those actions. I think they're overly violent. They basically hijacked this university as a form of protest, and eventually there was a siege of the university. Police surrounded the university and wouldn't let anyone in or out. The protesters got hungry and tired, and eventually the police entered using rubber bullets and sponge grenades. What the hell are sponge grenades? I don't know. I have no idea. If you know, please get in touch and let me know, because right now I really can't be bothered to Google it. Sponge grenades. Yep, sponge grenades. SpongeBob SquarePants grenades. Yeah, SpongeBob SquarePants grenades. Very interesting. A video game player protested for democracy in Hong Kong at a professional tournament. He is a professional video game player known for playing Hearthstone, a card game which is very, very good and made by Blizzard. In an official interview after he won his game, he said, "Liberate Hong Kong, revolution of our time." He said this while he was wearing goggles and a mask, which are common items worn by the protesters to protect their identity in Hong Kong. After he made this statement, the video game company Blizzard banned him for 1 year. He couldn't play the game for 1 year. They also forced him to give up thousands of dollars of prize money which he had won in 2019. And they fired the hosts who interviewed him. This was a very big deal because it's essentially an American company that is bowing to the demands of China. And they are not reasonable demands. The American company, Blizzard, is basically saying that freedom of speech is not allowed. They are silencing their players, suppressing freedom of speech. They are acting as a censor for China and trying to silence the protesters. Not only that, but they are sending a message that anyone who protests against China will be punished similarly. If that doesn't destroy freedom of speech, I don't know what does. If you can't criticize things, people, governments, policies, if you can't criticize these things, then there is no democracy, there is no freedom of speech. Now, you could argue that Blizzard was not punishing this player for protest, was not defending China. They were not defending China. They just don't want their company to be associated with any political movements. You could argue that they just want to stay neutral. They don't want to be involved in any kind of protest. Fine. I don't agree with that. I think that when good people do nothing, evil prevails. And I understand if people don't want to get involved in an argument, but big companies do have a responsibility to set an example and stand up for people who cannot stand up for themselves. So you could argue that they're trying to stay neutral, but they're not. And I will explain why in just a second. But basically, after this situation, a lot of gamers protested against Blizzard. How did they protest? Well, this time the protest was in the form of a boycott. They boycotted the video games made by Blizzard. A lot of people boycotted Blizzard as a result of them bowing to China and acting as a censor for China. Boycotts are a fairly common way to protest. Someone might boycott a TV show or a product because of the political or social beliefs held by the company or an executive or something. The reason why I think they were bowing to China was because their parent company, Activision, during these recent American protests, the Activision Blizzard Twitter account tweeted, "Today and always, we support all those who stand against racism and inequality. There is no place for it in our society or any society. Black Lives Matter." And there was a massive backlash against this company, against Activision Blizzard, because of how they acted when they banned Blitzchung, the video game player, for voicing his opinion, for protesting during their professional tournament. So they have been accused of double standards, silencing one protest because of demands from China, while supporting another protest which doesn't involve China, because they can, because it doesn't risk their profits. It's kind of, it's disappointing. It's very disappointing. So the Hong Kong protests and riots have been quite bad. A lot of assault, a lot of violence, a lot of breaking into public buildings and vandalizing them. They've been pretty bad. Chinese gangsters assaulting people, protesters, assaulting protesters. It's been pretty bad. But there have been a lot of famous protests which have been even worse. What? Tiananmen Square, China, 1989. At least 1 million people, mostly students, had gathered and occupied Tiananmen Square for 7 weeks. They wanted democratic reform, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, greater accountability by politicians, and greater transparency by the government. Their message and their goals were a little bit disorganized and varied. So they were in Tiananmen Square for 7 weeks, and eventually the Chinese military entered with tanks and automatic weapons and just killed a lot of these student protesters and innocent bystanders, just people watching. China has always had a bad reputation when it comes to civil liberties and human rights, and there are a lot of rumors of people disappearing, such as protesters and human rights activists. So China doesn't really tolerate protests and freedom of speech very much. A lot of information on the internet is hidden or suppressed, or closely watched. So they know exactly who is criticizing their government, and they delete anything they don't like. Free speech gives birth to protest, but protest does not give birth to free speech, as we can see in China. There are times when protests cannot be suppressed. And the next protest is quite violent. The Storming of Bastille. On the 14th of July, 1789, the Parisians marched on Bastille, a prison which was a symbol of royal authority. The Parisians entered the prison, killed the governor, and overtook the prison. Almost 4 years later, the last king of France, Louis XVI, was beheaded on the 21st of January 1793. So, not all protests are decent and peaceful. Many people believe that Louis XVI was not such a bad king, nor was his queen, Marie Antoinette, so bad. She is famous for saying, let them eat cake. Let them eat cake. In response to one of the famines that happened during the reign of Louis XVI. However, there were no actual famines during the reign of Louis XVI. There was a bread shortage, and Marie Antoinette wrote a letter to her family in Austria which paints a completely different picture of who she is. The letter said, "It is quite certain that in seeing the people who treat us so well, despite their own misfortune, we are more obliged than ever to work hard for their happiness. The king seems to understand this truth." Marie Antoinette. She's saying, the people are poor, but they still treat us so well. So, we have to work hard for their happiness. It doesn't really seem like she's a terrible person, but there were protests, and Louis XVI was killed, as was Marie Antoinette. So, not all protests are peaceful, and not all causes are right, and not all methods are good. Some go too far. Some are justified, and some are extinguished. The final protest I will mention is from Mahatma Gandhi. Another form of protest, probably his most famous form of protest, was his hunger strike, his fast. His longest fast was for 21 days, and this was to encourage unity between Hindus and Muslims in India. He also fasted in protest against a new India constitution, which would have given the lowest caste in India, known as the Untouchables, a separate political representation. He didn't want that. He didn't want the Untouchables to have a separate political representation. He wanted them to be part of the current political system, equally. Gandhi also broke the law as a form of protest. He went on a 23-day, 240-mile journey to the coast of India to collect his own salt, which was illegal under British laws, because all salt belongs to the Queen. The British people, the British soldiers, I imagine, arrested and imprisoned over 60,000 people, including Gandhi himself, for participating in the Salt March. But this helped the international community to sympathize with India. He was quite a successful protester. So yeah, there have been a lot of protests and protest events, from the self-immolation of, and my pronunciation here is going to be terrible, but Thich Quang Duc, as a protest against Buddhists by the South Vietnamese government, to musicians protesting against famine and disease in Africa and raising funds for Africa by hosting Live 8 and Live Aid. From staying in bed like John Lennon and Yoko Ono as a protest against war, to Keith Haring's or Banksy's protest art. There are lots of different ways to protest. Holding up signs, chanting, singing, marching, walking for miles, fasting, fighting, rioting, breaking the law, staying in one place, bending the knee, boycotting, wearing a mask, setting things on fire, taking over buildings, killing. There are a lot of ways to protest, and in a way, we protest things every day by complaining to friends, writing things on Twitter, deciding not to shave or wear makeup, getting tattoos, or even dyeing your hair, because protest is just showing that you don't agree with something. So, how have you protested lately? Is there something that you want to protest against? Is there something that you disagree with politically, socially, economically? Let me know. If you want protest against this podcast. Today's podcast was a bit dark and a bit deep, but I hope you learnt some new words and learnt about protests, about different ways to protest. Join me on the next one and download the transcript. There is a lot of extra content on the transcripts, extra information. www.greensquare.jp/podcasts. Again, www.greensquare.jp/podcasts. Podcasts. Please, 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 please like and subscribe. And I'll see you on the next one. What do we want? Sham Talk. When do we want it? Now.